Just a heads up before we get started that this week's episode is extensively concerned with suicide. Please take care, and if anything you hear raises issues or challenges, call Lifeline on 131114 or a local service wherever you're listening.
You doing okay?
I'm doing great. I have this wonderful boyfriend. I got an advance on a book of personal essays. Me, personal essays. I mean, who am I, Sloane Crosley?
Who's Sloane Crosley?
Good point. Who's Sloane Crosley?
Yeah, who is Sloane Crosley?
Exactly.
That clip comes from the Netflix adult cartoon series BoJack Horseman. It's a personal favourite, a very, very funny show. So it's hard not to think that being name-checked in it would be a thrill for a very, very funny person. And it makes sense. New York Times best-selling author Sloane Crosley is synonymous with a particular kind of personal essay. Her debut collection, I Was Told There'd Be Cake, made her a literary sensation. She's talked about in the same vein as David Rakoff or David Sedaris. Funny, acerbic and revealing. And she's written several acclaimed books since then, including 2 novels. I got to meet her when she visited Australia back in 2019. I was hosting a book club with her discussing the work of Joan Didion. Before making it as a writer in her own right, Sloane had worked with Didion, amongst many others, as a publicist for vintage books. We had a great conversation. Sloane is as witty and astute in person as she is on the page. And we talked about Didion's power as an essayist, about her legacy and her influence. And, inevitably, we talked about how she wrote about grief and loss, particularly in her masterpiece, My Year of Magical Thinking. What I didn't know at the time was that Sloane was deep in her own experience of grief and loss, freshly trying to make sense of a sequence of personal catastrophes that had left her devastated. Now, several years and a global pandemic later, she's written about those tragedies in her new book, Grief is for People. And it's the best thing she's written yet. I'm Michael Williams, and this is Read This, a show about the books we love and the people behind them. The personal essay is a deeply revealing and confessional form, but to a certain extent it's still self-contained. Structure and brevity can go a long way towards the writer controlling just how much they let the reader in. And that might be doubly true of the comic essay, diffusing true intimacy with a joke. Part of what makes Sloane Crosley's book Grief is for People such an accomplished work, and one that I know I'm going to return to again and again, is that it so skillfully combines humour and honesty, form and content, in ways that draw a reader closer and utterly disarm with her brutal clarity about grief and loss.
It's 5 parts, sort of full length. They're connected, and I keep calling them full narrative nonfiction connected chapters. And my editor's like a memoir. Is that the shorthand word for it? But it's about a series of unfortunate events. I had a burglary in mid-2019, and then my closest friend died by suicide exactly a month later, down to the hour. And then the pandemic hit. So it sort of follows these different sorts of grief. So obviously the title is it's not just for people. But it's a very strange experience because it's so objectively sad. But I do think it still makes me laugh occasionally. I've always said that I feel like fiction is more exposing than nonfiction for me. And I think with this book, that ends.
Yeah.
This feels very, very blood on the field to me.
I was going to ask your publisher kind of gently trying to steer you to the word memoir.
Yes.
I mean,
well, just also for shorthand because interconnected narrative nonfiction chapters.
Catchy.
I mean, I've already fallen asleep just saying the sentence.
No.
Yeah.
I've seen that part of the bookshop. It's a little sign on the top and a decal on the shelves. But writing personal essays means that you've had a career now of people feeling like they know you from what you write on the page. That's memoir in micro form again and again and again.
Yeah, if you do your job well, yeah.
What's the distinction here? Is it just about length, or is it about the nature of the subject matter that makes you feel more exposed?
I think it's a little bit of both. When it comes to the length part, there is a bit of a hit and run quality to an essay. where before you can be grilled too deeply, especially if you're writing humor and you're not writing, some sort of political polemic, you can sort of sneak in a few larger bits of life wisdom or observation in between making people laugh and then run as fast as you can off the page. And so for this, it's just more sustained. There's sort of a deeper exploration of certain ideas. And the other thing that's different is I feel a lot of responsibility in more ways than I have before with this book. So with the burglary aspect, I'm very conscious of what might be considered a sort of privilege loss, where normally I don't care what that comes off as. With the suicide, I know that this is a global health issue that touches a lot of people. And also, this was not my partner, my father, or my child. And this is someone who has those people in his life still. Figuring out how to wrestle with writing about a friend is very, very difficult because, especially if it's not a famous friend, because this is their sort of accidental biography, even though I am not his biographer. And then the other thing, of course, then is the pandemic, which oh my God, do we need to hear about the hand sanitizer, and so my friend is really my North Star through all of this when I feel like I am starting to tread on really cliche ground or potentially offensive ground. I just remember that this is the obituary he never got.
And it is a love letter to him. It is about your friendship, and what comes through incredibly powerfully is I got a sense of the kind of reader he might have been and the kind of responses he would have given you to the book.
Oh, that's great.
It's a strange, I can only imagine writing it must have been hard because, as you say, the obituary he never got, but also he was a kind of singular and acute critic of the world.
Yeah, so he was my old boss in publishing, so I worked with him for 10 years. And, sort of as I say in the book, our sort of job titles very quickly became these meaningless strings of code, and he would get very annoyed at me at parties if I introduced him as my boss, and he'd be like, I introduce you to people as my friend. And I'm like, you can fire me, but thanks for playing. But, and we were just extremely close in a way where I considered him both as an older brother figure and a father figure. And I think he thought the same of me. And that's what's so challenging to write about a single death in your life, is that you still are so loyal to that person. And you have to learn to also be loyal to the people that are still here. And I think that's a real challenge of writing something that I know he would approve of, but also writing something for a larger audience and something that's really about us and not just about him. Because if I couldn't write his biography, I knew one part of his life.
But you are writing a biography of a friendship.
Yes. It's been done before, but not without consequence. I mean, I think that a really great example is Truth and Beauty. The Anne Patchett is a really beautiful story about her friendship with Lucy Greerley. And the suicide aspect of it is especially difficult and gruesome because to be horribly craven, when you pick up the book that it's barreling towards something really bad, which I suppose creates this sort of perverse sense of suspense, because people rubberneck when it comes to suicide. Some of them glamorize it, which is a really disturbing trend in our culture. But in exchange, it's so muddled and it's just not this clean-cut thing, and there's just this mystery that's inherent to it, so you're never really going to solve it. It's just sort of a challenge to write about, I guess. I don't know.
Part of why the book is so powerful is it's not just about grieving, it's an act of grieving. And so clearly for you, there's something indivisible in the writing process and the finding ways to come to terms with your own kind of emotional state. Was that a new thing for you, working something through on the page?
I think that the idea of achieving catharsis through writing is not a good one. to my mind. I think it's a great one for private writing, and I think it can be an unbelievable side effect. But I think if that's your goal, you might be in trouble. You know, there's a great Annie Dillard quote in The Writing Life where she says, she uses this very like woodsy analogy. And she said, when you're chopping wood, you should never aim for the wood. You should aim for the chopping block. You should aim just past the wood. And so I feel like the catharsis or something, you know, working through something would be the wood in this case. And the chopping block would be trying to tell this story that I feel like is important and that hasn't existed in a way that I felt like was important, but not so much to get myself over it. But I think what's interesting is the first few chapters, it's about timing, you know? My friend died on July 27th, 2019. And even in the book, I say, you know, I'm writing these pages, I'm starting on August 27th, 2019, which I now look back and think that is absolutely insane. And even I acknowledge in the moment saying, you know, and I'll be editing this much, much later after a dozen or so 27ths have passed. And, you know, by then I'll be able to hear his name or hear a certain song or hear a certain, you know, line of dialogue without flinching. But I feel like I think I did it almost too close to when something happened. Like I do a lot of readings and, you know, I've written 3 books of personal essays, and at every reading, you know, there's somebody or somebodies who are aspiring writers, and a lot of it is people who are aspiring writers about their own personal story. And a very frequent question is when to start. When do I write about my divorce? When do I write about this? And I'm like, oh, that's between you and your gods. This is the real answer. But I do feel like there's this sort of ineffable time period where you can still access everything, but you're not still weeping onto the page. And I think I was still weeping onto the page a bit. It's been edited out slightly, but I think it's okay. I think it's an okay book.
So if comedy is tragedy plus time, that being funny about grief, that does seem, from the way you describe him, an important part of honouring your friend to make sure that you're not afraid to be blackly funny whenever you get the chance.
Well, I think that I am fortunate in the fact that I was so close and loved so deeply someone who is so dark and so funny and irreverent and wildly inappropriate. And so I think even at the book's sort of darkest depths and my own darkest depths, always present is the absolute ridiculousness of the situation. Do you know, of like that? I'm like, what did you do to yourself? Are you crazy? Do you know what I mean? I can feel it. Of course, there's black humor to it. I mean, I actually was coming to Australia right after he died, and he was supposed to cat sit for me while I was in Australia. And this is just an example, I guess, from the book that embodies the book, me and him. And I had to hire a cat sitter who I knew vaguely, you know, and I said something, I texted her, and I was like, can you come watch the cat while I'm away? She said, oh, I thought you had someone doing it. And it's so crazy to think how much you are just, and this is a big focus of the book, how much you're just not on the side of the living when you're in grief in this fundamental way. And you would throw anyone under the bus to get them back. And it's like you're really not to be trusted in a certain way. People are surrounding you. They're sort of showering you with love and support. And you know, your conscious mind appreciates it very much. But like there's something fundamental that's blocking it from really sort of seeping in. And so she said, you know, I thought you had someone watching the cat. And I said, oh, well, the old cat sitter killed himself. And I could see the dots, you know, go up. And I was like, oh, damn it. And so to quote unquote fix the situation, I wrote back, I mean, just say you don't want to do it, right? And, you know, and obviously that's in the book, but I don't know. I mean, I feel like in a way there's always been a thread of the sad clown in everything I've written, even if it's not pronounced. And I think this is bringing out those flavors more in this book.
When we return, Sloane Crosley describes her friend Russell and reveals the jokes that were too dark to include, even for her. We'll be right back. Can you, for listeners to the podcast who won't have read it yet, can you describe Russell for them?
Yes, of course, yeah. And it's such a dream to be asked to do that in front of other people. I mean, it's what everyone sort of wants when they have someone who loves who dies. You want to get out like the megaphone and the skywriting. He was this incredibly irreverent, but also very supportive person. So he was as supportive and loving as he was inappropriate, which is why I felt like he had a difficult time in the era of like Me Too in the past 10 years, because a lot of the things he said quite rightly should not fly. But also they didn't come with this like nefarious like root system of, well, sex or preferential treatment or not giving people raises, you know? I mean, it just came with a puppyishness that, you know, puppies can play too hard. But he was just a wildly curious person and he loved old things. It's a perfect place for him to work is Vintage, which is all the backlists of every author you can think of pretty much is published there. You know, I mean, it's really this sort of incredible, formidable list. And, you know, reissuing old anniversary editions of things, but also in his personal life, he'd go to the flea market and collect things and like old music, old movies, all of these things. And he just had like a lot of energy. He was also a gay man with a partner, and they lived in Connecticut, and we would go up to their house a lot. I guess the last I'll say about it is really one of the first things I say about it in the book is that we sort of swapped roles as they do in experimental theater. Where like sometimes it felt like I was his sister, sometimes it felt like I was his daughter, sometimes it felt like I was his parent, his partner, like all of these different things. But, you know, I mean, these relationships, it's not like I'm the first person to be like, oh, wow, there's this relationship no one's talking about. But I do think they get reduced to these sort of poppy terms like work wife or work husband. And it felt like more than that.
Who did he like to read?
Wow, that's a great question. I mean, there was almost nothing he didn't read. But he really loved, he got John Williams's Stoner back into print. He loved old memoirs. He loved Juliet Suka, was like a real pet of his. He loved her books. Toni Morrison was no one's pet, but they were quite close. He liked books about sort of underdogs or coming of age stories. I mean, what sticks out for me more, and unfortunately I can't really say it on the podcast, are the authors and the books that he couldn't stand.
I'm curious, throughout Grief, you reference the ways in which it was written in real time. So there are periods where you're writing through the thing that you're writing about as you do it. And I'm curious about the editing process with the book. How much did you go back to it and decide you wanted to impose certain literary devices or certain literary rules to give yourself a bit of distance from the material?
Well, I liked anything that sort of served what is hopefully the non-cheesy, non-cliche book about storytelling aspect of Grief is for People. So, you know, it's this sort of like this timestamp that's like, how do we enter the story? How do we tell the story? And like that sort of strange realism, that process of writing something and that inherent lie, especially if it's narrative nonfiction, of the present tense, when you're like, this was written, we all, even if we're not publishing insiders, we all have a sense that, you know, the books are not printed or written the week before. So I just was trying to sort of pierce through that. I remember the moment when I realized that Russell had died. So I get my jewelry stolen on around 6 p.m. on June 27th, 2019. And then I didn't find out Russell died until the next day. So it was much later, and it's not really in the book, but that I was wandering around thinking, sort of just doing the math on his death and realizing when it was and realizing it was exactly, you know, because when I found out it was not the 1 month anniversary. So once I had that sort of structure of these two 27ths, I did start looking for them, and they came kind of naturally. Like I found out about that the jewelry had been discovered, you know, some of it on eBay on a 27th. Like there were so many things that just sort of happened to the point where I kept thinking, well, I'm going to hide in my closet on August 27th, so nothing bad happens. But really the structure comes from the second part is the truth of it. So basically you've got these 5 stages of grief, and they're loose. They're used in a sort of half respectful, half tongue-in-cheek way, if that makes any sense at all. But when I was trying to get the jewelry back, to actually get it back, it was the same time I was in a stage of grief that like really felt like bargaining. Like, this didn't really have to happen, did it? This actually can't be real. So I personally have never had a sort of thematic kind of vein and a structural vein overlay so perfectly on top of each other. Whether or not it's effective, I'm not trying to say it's like brilliant. I'm just saying this is, for me, as I was writing it, bargaining locked in first, and then the others sort of just fell into place really naturally.
The concept of memoir has a lie in it, but also the concept of grief has a lie in it. The idea that there are ways that we cope or that these things are linear. And Kubler-Ross is a prime example of that, where we're told, here's a structure, here's a way in which we can make sense of something that feels utterly nonsensical. Was it still useful, either personally or creatively, to have that lie, to have that structure to work with?
I debated. I put them on, I took them off, put them on, I took them off. And then I eventually decided that the nature of the book is that hopefully I have a sort of readership or an audience by the time a reader gets about halfway through, they're sort of used to my style of storytelling, so that when you get to, like, let's say the last 2 sections and they start from an unexpected place or they go back in time a lot, you're not like, I don't trust this person. I don't know where I'm going. But I think that maybe the stages are a little bit of a crutch almost to like delineate them, and a little signpost to say, this is what this is going to be about eventually. And I debated whether or not it needed that. And then ultimately, I just feel like because there were 5 sections, it seemed almost strange to not put them on.
It gives it this weight of momentum, but it also, as is often the case in a grief memoir, gives it an expectation of catharsis or healing. And,
Ta-da!
You quite actively resist that, and I think that tension's really interesting in the book.
Oh, thank you. I mean, I pull from more established, brilliant writers like, Natalia Ginsburg saying, you can't really hope for catharsis or to be soothed by your profession. Yeah, I don't feel that cathartic thing. I think I was telling someone just today, now that everything's sort of settled a little bit with the book here, that I wonder if I was accidentally describing catharsis. Like I'm going around saying, no, I don't feel this. I don't feel this. But I do feel that I think it's almost, it's such ego and such hubris to say it like this. But, I wanted to give Russell sort of a slightly better ending. It's like throwing like a gum wrapper on a, all of China. But so it's not much, but I do feel like that for the book, like it sort of tweaked my last thought. Like you have this amazing meal that's this friendship, and then you have a really, 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 really bad dessert with shards of glass in it. And then like the book is like, those little chunks of chocolate that come with the bill. There's like a little, So I don't know if that's catharsis though, because I think catharsis is more about a personal process. And a sort of transformative process and a feeling. And I don't feel necessarily transformed by the book. I feel like I just wrote an elegy that is appropriate in tone for the person who died.
Part of what's so lovely about it is that a key factor of your friendship with Russell and the stuff you did together was exactly this. It was books and working out how to frame and tell a story and how to do justice to it, and being scathing and skeptical about it when it doesn't work and holding it to a high standard. The bookishness of it feels inseparable from the Russell you describe. Did you find yourself trying to repress your natural joke instincts in this book, or did you happily kind of just let them live there alongside the more angsty content?
So in some ways, yes, in some ways, no. Like there's a way to read through the book as I did. You read through your book a billion times with different things in mind. Hopefully not the audience of everyone who hates you, although it is kind of sometimes healthy if painful to just do one read like that. But in some ways, I feel like because it's Russell too, and because he was so funny, and some of the humor really is stolen from him, that I just sort of let it rip. It's such a tricky subject, and it's so unique, that you're just like, I don't want to, like, it's so strange. I don't think anything else where I have assign myself as part of a group of people, as a writer, as a woman, as someone who's Jewish, as someone who's a vegetarian, like whatever it is, as an owner of a cat, I have never thought, okay, well, I am not necessarily like the other people in this group. In fact, I have been sort of bolstered by being in whatever that group is. This is really the first time where I'm like, I'm really worried about offending people who have been affected by suicide. Like, in other words, I don't get a pass.
Yeah.
Just because this happened to me. So every once in a while, there was a joke that I feel like went too far in there and was too distracting. Like, you'll notice that there's no, it was very difficult to do, but there were several points in which, like, the possibility of referencing enough rope to hang yourself came up, and it's not in the book because I'm like, it's too much.
I imagine even with comic essays, you would have quite a bit of readers feeling like they know you because of the nature of the content and projecting things onto you and relating to you in different ways. But I similarly imagine that for this book, that's happened at a whole other level.
It's more tearful. I mean, in a way, I have the muscle or the experience of what it's like to write something personal. And it's like I had the talking stick for a long time in these people's minds. And they've come to a reading, which is wonderful. It's very easy to not do things. They have left their house and done a thing. And it's like their turn to have the talking stick. So they just sort of, so I know, if it's a story I've written about, being suckered into being a bridesmaid for someone who I didn't know very well, or somehow miraculously getting fired from a volunteer job, or whatever I've written about in the past, I know that my job is to let them close the loop. I think what I'm struggling with, and this is more probably an issue for my therapist than this, but you know what? I have a microphone in front of me, so great, is how to engage with it and sort of, if I may be so earnest, be enriched by it without letting it sink straight into my skin and taking it home with me, and without just sort of numbing out and saying, oh, I'm so sorry for your loss. Thank you. There must be something that, so I'm still sort of working on that.
At the end of having written Grief is for People, do you want to go back to the essay? Are you craving that shorter form? Or do you find yourself now you've flown business class and you're like, you've had your leg room?
I think probably I will go back to essays. I think it's going to be hard, but it was going to be hard anyway, to do the sort of tap dancing, cymbal bashing, monkey humor essays, the humor of exasperation, the don't you just hate it when stand up. And I don't think I'll ever really lose that, because in a way it's how I think and how I function. But this has been a really, I don't mean to sort of dismiss this book by calling it an exercise, but a really nice exercise in realizing that is a muscle I can use to tackle bigger things. But I don't know what form that necessarily. It's not like I'll never write nonfiction again, or never write fiction again. I mean, I think that I have a couple of ideas percolating, and I just don't know where they fit yet.
Sloane Crosley's latest book, Grief is for People, is available at all good bookstores now. And if you need a little more levity afterwards, I can recommend her most recent novel, Cult Classic. Came out in 2022, and it's terrific. Before we go, a brief digression from me this week that picks up on some of the themes of the episode. One of the truly enjoyable things about Grief is for People is its portrait of the publishing industry, of the people who work to put books out into the world. It can, from the outside, be something of an opaque process. Editors and publicists and designers and agents, all manner of people behind the scenes, making it possible for a writer to connect with a reader. Some of those people don't work in the commercial part of the publishing world either. There are teachers and writing groups, organisations and support structures that make the sometimes lonely or fragmented work of writers possible to sustain when the market itself is such a cold and unforgiving place. In Australia, one of the people who did that work in extraordinary and tireless ways was a woman called Kate Callingham. Kate worked across the arts, but I got to know her when she was Executive Director of the Emerging Writers Festival in Melbourne. She was a fierce advocate for writers and writing, and an endlessly smart, funny, thoughtful member of the literary community. She died in an accident last week, far too young, and it's a tragedy that will be felt acutely by many. She's one of the people behind the books you love, even if you didn't know her, and she's a massive loss. Our deepest sympathy to her family and friends. That's it for this week's show. If you enjoyed it, please tell your friends and rate and review us. Next week on Read This, I chat with debut author Winnie Dunn about being a trailblazer for Tongan Australian stories and her new book, Dirt Poor Islanders.
I really don't subscribe to writing for the sake of, trauma dumping or getting your trauma out. That's what a therapist is for, please. Please go see a therapist.
We're very pro-therapy on Read This.
If that's what you're using writing for.
Read This is produced and edited by Clara Ames. Mixing and original compositions by Zoltan Fetcher, with special thanks this week to Atticus Bastow. Thanks for listening. See you next week.